How to harvest static electricity. Well, let's start with what static electricity is. Back in the day, a guy named Michael Faraday took a glass rod and would rub it with a cloth to generate static electricity. Now, today you can kind of do the same thing by taking a latex balloon, rubbing it on your head, and it'll create a static electricity bubble on the outside of it, which you can then use to lift up small pieces of paper. And if you hold it next to a stream of water, it'll actually put the balloon there. The water will actually bend around the water. It's a wonderful thing, water, and how it's affected by static electricity, but that's another story. We'll get into how to harvest this right now, so let's stay focused. What people of past times have done is they took a structure, let's say it looks just like the Great Giza Pyramid, and they made the structure with a rough surface area. What this would cause is static electricity brush discharge would form on the surface of the structure, and nature would have that static electricity vent down to the ground and vent up to the atmosphere above it. In this particular case, what we're going to do is we're going to actually mimic the structure, neuter the top by taking that off, so the static electricity can't really vent up into the higher altitudes. And we're going to put a barrier at the 35th level, a ring around the entire structure, which will quarantine that static electricity to the surface of the structure, which compensates why people were able to climb up there and would have their hair stand up on end and fill their Leyden jars and do other experiments where static could fly from their fingertips and stuff like that. Today, we vent that static electricity off by putting a nice antenna up at the top of it, a nice wooden structure, which vents that static electricity up into the higher altitudes. And I'm not so sure that they haven't put like a pile of dirt and stuff there to kind of make it so there's not a gap, but I don't know if they actually knew exactly what they were doing or understood exactly what was going on, but they definitely put an antenna on the top there. And they did that just because they found it alleviated static electricity, which was annoying when people would actually climb up there, get a static electricity bubble around them, and they'd climb back down, and as they breached the 35th level there, they'd get like a little static jolt, and they'd be like, "Ow, Grandma, that hurt!" And Grandma would be like, "Ow, Sonny, that hurt!" And people would be like, "Hey, how do we stop annoying these people?" Well, number one, let's make them so they no climbing the structure. We'll give you a myriad of reasons, but we're just going to say no climbing the structure. Well, I mean, you could fall and get hurt and then sue them and stuff like that. So nowadays, with our sue-happy country, world, we're talking world here, this is not in the United States, this is located in Cairo there in Egypt. But either case, so here we have this bubble of static electricity. So what are we going to do with it? Well, what you could do is somebody could walk up there, fill a Leyden jar, I don't know, whatever a Leyden jar wants to look like. Okay, let's make a Leyden jar, all right? And then bring it down and fill it into something with a high enough capacity, a capacitor, that you would short the Leyden jar to the capacitor, and then go back up, refill it, come back down, dump it, come back up, fill it, come back, dump it, and eventually you'd be moving that static electricity to the capacitor till you got enough static electricity to do whatever you wanted to do. Take Grandma and give her a really nice jolt, or it's a bunch of power, but it's a quick discharge. That's why it's like a capacitor. In this particular case, it's going to be constantly forming. So if we did it right, we could do some sort of a conveyor belt, the opposite of a Van de Graaff generator, where they have that rubber band, which would, short to the different layers and would pull a static electricity up and dump it on the surface of, how a Van de Graaff generator works with its rubber band, pulling the static electricity up, dumping it onto the surface of the structure until the surface of the structure becomes more and more static electricity. In this case, we're going to do the opposite. Only instead of using a big rubber band, we're going to utilize water. More to the fact, water vapor, steam, and/or in some cases actually precipitation. The more you can do it. Just like if you could take this and you could just have water dripping off of it, that water would be charged, and if you could get it to pool like you would a Lord Kelvin water drop generator to pool, you would eventually build up enough of a capacity there within that vessel to do something with, make a spark. What we're going to do is we're going to coax it down. Well, I'm not going to do this to scale, because to true scale it would come down at the halfway mark, but we're going to pull it down from up here, bring it down into the area. Well, it doesn't actually come into the King's Chamber. King's Chamber actually has a slightly other function, but there's a conduit that slightly short of that falls into the area they like to call the Thieves' Tunnel. The static electricity would be brought down into the Thieves' Tunnel, where it's brought out and down the area they like to call the Grand Gallery. Now, I like to call that the condensing room, and this I like to actually call the combustion chamber. We'll get into that in a second. And down here, the area they like to call the Queen's Chamber, I like to refer to that as the arc room. And you'll see why I name them that as you follow the system. So the conduit would be pulling static electricity down within this conduit, and the way this is actually shaped, that conduit actually comes across there. But again, you have to forgive my artistic license, and I'm not doing this to scale. But you're more than welcome to look at internal drawings of the structure, and if you really can't find one, contact me at c@giza.ws or contact@greatgizapyramid.com, and I will be more than happy to direct you. Actually, you can just go to photos.giza.ws or photos.greatgizapyramid.com or photos.gizapyramidproject.com, and I have photographs of sketches or images of sketches of the internal structure. But either way, the static electricity will be brought down that conduit, down this grand gallery, which you notice is ribbed on the sides. That is to allow for the condensation of the water vapor and a constant dripping. This whole section will be like a big, huge rain forest. Constantly dripping. That constant dripping is going to be pulling the static electricity down, which will allow a replacement of the static electricity naturally to form on the outside of the structure, because once the outside of the structure reaches its capacity, nature will find the path of least resistance. It will either breach the barrier at the 35th level, or it will vent up into the upper atmosphere regardless. It won't care. The stunting of it by making this flat will only create a bubble of static electricity, just like a Van de Graaff generator. Once you reach the capacity, it won't get more and more and more. It will eventually just vent off into the ambient air, because nature pours a vacuum and it will just vent off. This will eventually vent off one way or another. We're just quarantining it, pulling it down. This area right here is going to be furthest away from what I refer to as the combustion chamber. It's going to be the coolest, the most condensing, and as the water vapor condenses, it's going to lose surface area. As each water drop has surface area, when water drops join, the surface area lessens, and hence the static electricity is going to lose area to work. The opposite of a steam engine, as it condenses, is going to create a vacuum or a lesser pressure, which is going to pull more steam into this room. So by default, the system is not only going to be having the precipitation bringing the static electricity down, but you also will have a slight suction within this room, again pulling static electricity in. Now, you're going to say, all that static electricity is going to fill with water and it's going to pool up and pool up and pool up. That's great and wonderful, but if you look at the system, there's what they like to call the well shaft, which is appropriately named, which goes down to the area they like to call the grotto. I call that the cathode, because this is where the hydrogen actually vents off the system. And down in the lower section, they like to have the area they like to call the unfinished room. That is actually the anode to the system. And we'll get to this in just one second. I'll show you the whole scenario here. The cathode, where the hydrogen is coming off, they have holes drilled in the southern wall of that room. they say are for hiding scrolls and things like that, if you want to go with the tomb dogma. But being that we're not looking at the tomb dogma here, we'll just follow that conduit, which actually brings the hydrogen up to and above the combustion chamber into the area they like to call the relieving chambers. From there, the hydrogen will be deposited, and since hydrogen has an upward motion because of buoyancy and density, it will fill this area from the top down. Now it will actually, because the combustion chamber is kind of sealed, will come down and come up through the floor where there's a pit in the west-north corner that they've since covered over with a metal plate painted to look like rock, but if you walk over to it and bang on it, ding, 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 you notice it is a metal plate. I have pictures from the 1990s, and you can see it's a pit about 10 feet deep, and the bottom structure has a unique configuration with a pooling such that the hydrogen gas will bubble into one chamber and then bubble out of that chamber up into the pit itself. And this will be a flashback arrestor so that the combustion, which is occurring within this room, will not get to the pool of hydrogen and you have a nasty explosion. It is a controlled system. They engineered this very well. Anyway, this will be a combustion. Now, hydrogen doesn't burn by itself. Well, it might, but we kind of need another thing for it to burn with, and that is what the conduit that breaches the surface of the structure, the one that comes off the south side, and the only one that exits the structure. This one is actually it comes to the surface but doesn't breach the surface. This will allow the combustion within this particular chamber to let the gas, the steam, be pushed up that particular conduit, and since steam likes to rise, it'll go up, it'll condense, and then come back down. And as it condenses and comes back down, it's going to bring some of that static electricity with it. It's going to fall into this room here, come out into here, and go down the system like I said. As the water fills here, it actually will come over and spill down into what they like to call the well shaft, and will join the waters that are actually the lower part of the system. Now, those waters are separated by the top by just a few feet right there, where the water will fall down and be separated. So this will be a controlled and isolated system. Now, this conduit will fill with water, but you'll see here that initially that water shorted to the pool because there are 3 granite rocks there, and the static electricity taking the path of least resistance will go down and go to the pool and, join with nature, because that's what static electricity does, looks for the path of least resistance. But I did tell you this was the anode. That anode is going to be venting oxygen, where the cathode is venting hydrogen. Now that's, electrolysis 101, and we'll get to the energies that controlled this in a minute. Just look at the system right now. Hydrogen off of here, oxygen off of here. This is shorting to Earth right here, and this is going to be greater than Earth. Let's see, greater than, I don't know what, I guess Earth would be ground, like so. Actually, technically, in today's thing, we put ground as such. This would be a voltage that is greater than ground. This right here would be your ground. That's greater than ground because of the structure next to it, which actually has a smooth section at the top. The way this is stunted, this one actually shorts to there, and this one is shorting to the upper altitude, and it will have a greater than this one, actually, than the pool does, because we're really looking at the pool. This is isolated because of that barrier at the 35th level. So while we are looking at 2 different structures, we're actually looking at multiple different areas of what is at a higher voltage than what. And when you look at electrolysis, you only need 1.23 volts of power. It's less than a AA battery, less than a AAA battery. you know, your C battery, D battery, they all run at 1.5 volts, right? It's amazing. They all run about the same voltage. Even when you take a 9-volt battery, 9-volt battery is just a bunch of 1.3 volt batteries in series, isn't it? 1.23 volt batteries in series adds up to the 9 volts. So, gotta wonder why everything kind of works around the 1.23 volts there. But that's a story for another day when you get into electricity. But let's just look at the facts here. This is going to be manipulated to be greater than that. This is going to vent off your oxygen. The oxygen is actually going to have some play the way it comes out of the system, and there's bubbling thing there, and it creates a water pressure. And there's some other things that occur in the lower section, and you can look at my video, the system down under. But for right now, we're just looking at how the static electricity is isolated from the outside world. The oxygen, in this case, is going to be bubbling up through the system. It doesn't actually go up to the grotto because of the way that conduit is made. The one opening is below the level, so the oxygen comes up across the top and can't get into that conduit, which that conduit will remain saturated with water while the oxygen bubbles up through the system. Now, they say this was covered with loosely fitting rocks. That's fine. In my video where I refer to the, what do I like to call that, the entrance, the spillway, you can see that I believe it was slightly more configured than just loosely fitting rocks. But for right now, let's just put loosely fitting rocks. Just figure a pile of gravel there. Now, what's that pile of gravel going to do? It's going to create the air, oxygen, trying to fight up through the rocks as water is coming down the rocks, and you're going to create a air bubble, or in this case oxygen bubble, below it. Now, that oxygen bubble is going to separate the system within the structure from the system without the structure via an air gap, which will take this static electricity, which had its path to Earth here, and neuter that path to Earth and provide an alternate path, which was the conduit that was behind the rock, which was we only found because there was an electrical arc in the wall from years of that static electricity arcing through the wall to get to the conduit behind it. There was an electrical arc. We drilled through that crack to find the conduit behind it. Now, yes, there's a conduit on the other side as well, because anyone who dealt with electricity knows that in order to get first you have to have a flow for the electricity, and then you have to give a path of lesser resistance. Now, once you neuter here, you still need to provide a flow, a potential for that static electricity to get to. And this potential winds up shorting to what they like to call the Osiris's well shaft, which even today goes down below the water table. And that would be the true ground for the entire plateau, for the system that is the plateau. And when you look at all of this, it's all a big mathematical game of making the path of lesser resistance with the potential always attempting to get to this ground, but we wind up trapping it within the system, coming out through this conduit with its potential of still trying to get to here, but going to the pool that's actually under the third largest structure, which is half the height of this. In fact, the height of that structure is right at that level. And I did draw this intentionally because this, when you look at it, is the neutered part of that. So this is actually higher in elevation than this one is, even though this is the larger structure, because it's actually at a lower plane. And the water level on all three of these structures is approximately the same. Now, there's a little bit of a difference, but I only think it's a few feet difference between all of them. And that's the communication there you can see within the niche in the Queen's chamber, because the water levels of all three structures are noted on the niche, and the conduit within the niche, you notice as it goes deeper and deeper, it cuts off. It does steps of jumping up and down, and each one of those steps correlates to one of the elevations, and that gets more into the communication within the structure, which we can get into another video. But when you see the system, then you can understand the communication. But all the water levels of all the pools on all three of the structures are approximately the same, and they're all at a elevation which is less than the 35th level, about half the way through the Queen's Chamber. And the water level on the outside here is about yohai. The water level within the structure is actually at a lower elevation. And that has to do with the configuration of that spillway there, because the way the water is fighting to go up through it and bubbling out, and the water level coming in, it actually drops the water level within the system to a lower elevation. And that is either functional or just to allow for the communication within the structure. They were very good at relaying information if you take the time to actually follow the system. But either way, the ultimate system is taking the static electricity, which would naturally ground to Earth, quarantining it within the system, giving it an alternate path to again potentially get to the true ground, Earth, but trapping it within the system. And I do think there's more involved, but that's where we need to really model the system and see what else is happening, because what I haven't alluded to yet is this whole system is also working with what's referred to as heavy water. Heavy water would be, instead of H2O, we actually are going to be playing with D2O. And the D2O and its creep factors are actually going to be at play, because the heavy water is what's working within the system, constantly being cracked, brought up, formed water being coming down, cracking the bottom, brought up, constantly flowing through the system. And it's quarantined within the pools of light water, which are outside the system, and that heavy water is constantly looking for the path of least resistance. And also anybody who understands that heavy water actually needs 233 volts or 234 volts or it's slightly more. I think it's like half a 1,000th of a volt. Yes. So, which would mean that the heavy water will maintain in its liquid state, yielding any potential energies to the light water, which will maintain in its gaseous state until it condensates and returns back to water, and then would flow out of the system along with some of the heavy water, because everything is flowing, and it all goes down the spillway they like to call the whale shaft into the bottom, and wash, rinse, repeat, keeps going and going around in a circle. Now we can see how this will work with light water, and when you complicate it by adding heavy water, I think we're getting an even more efficient and or better system. But that is the basic energy flow, basic flow of the system, and we can even get into how, well, I got you as a captive audience, the elevations of the structure here are such that it comes down, maintains, you've got the room there in the center, it has a conduit way that comes down, across, and back up. And what this is allowing is that the water level here is making it so the pool outside this system is allowed to vent its energy up and out of the system here, having it to be at a more positive than this, which is quarantining it and being more negative. And this will allow for a condensation, because this particular area is below the water level of the system, and will allow for a condensation of something. Now I think we're going to have some play there with what exactly it's doing and why it's condensating in the way it is, and that it's condensating in a more of a positive atmosphere. This may be a very, very complicated type of a Lord Kelvin drop generator. Again, we're going to have to model it to actually see what's happening, but if you look at the potential energies that you can get from a Lord Kelvin drip generator, which is a very simple scenario of a pool of water separated into two dripping streams of water, you run it through two, well, usually it's like soup cans, shorted to two paint cans, and that water will run through there, deposit into there, through there, deposit into there. And the way the system works, one of these will be positive and one of these will be negative. And nature will dictate which one is which. It doesn't matter because you're going to get a difference in the potential. That's really all you need for any electricity is a difference in potential. And usually what they do is they take from there and they put two little balls and you have a static spark every couple of seconds there. And that energy can be used to do anything. Yes, it can be used to make an electric spark. You can also use it to do electroplating if you want to play with it. You can also have that and dump it into a capacitor like I was talking about. I don't know if it was this video or the other video. I'm getting lost in what video I'm on right now. But that energy could also be potentially quarantined and utilized. But that's an expansion for another day. So when you want me to discuss that, I'd be happy to go over that as well. Although there's a couple of gentlemen, rimstar.org or rimstar on YouTube, and a couple of other people who actually just go ahead and on YouTube just type in Lord Kelvin, Lord L-O-R-D Kelvin, Kelvin, the guy, L-V-I-N, the one that we have Kelvin, you got Fahrenheit, Celsius, and Kelvin. The Kelvin, the same guy, he was a famous dude. They decided to give him credit for a bunch of things. And drop generator is its technical name, although I like to call it drip generator, but drop generator is its technical name. But either case, I think I've done enough to confuse you. Get the ball rolling. I'd be happy to hear it. Oh, I didn't tell you the elevation within this structure. The elevation within this structure, the third one way over here, it is completely at a lower elevation. It comes in and goes down to an even lower elevation, and then has a second level down there. And you see the way it's shaped. It is allowing the liquids to separate, gases to come up, heavier things to go down. You really have to get internal guts of that. That's not something I really want to get into in this video. I'll do a whole nother video on that, but I urge you to take a look at it and you will see. And you also notice that there's a conduit that comes up, comes back down at an elevation, and then you have a ground that actually comes into the system and goes at an elevation which is just below here. So if we were to draw a line across here, if I had done this to scale, or to, not to scale, but to everything being at the correct height, the level at which this comes down is about to there within that system and here, and I believe this will create the potential for the liquids and gases within this structure wanting to get to here to reach that potential is where you know, in order to hold electricity, like anything else, even a battery, you have to have one and then the other. And the energies here are attempting to reach the energies here, only you give it a air gap or a, you know, some sort of a gap. Usually it's like a piece of cardboard or plastic or something, which creates a constant gap so that those potentials are there, and you keep them at just enough distance where it can't short. Now, of course, when it does short, you get a really nasty electrical burn, and you can talk about how come Tesla cars keep blowing up and stuff like that, or I should say melting. And that would be your reason for it. Any good capacitor or any good battery, eventually you're going to get either some corrosion or something which will allow the resistance factor between the two potentials to you know, have a gap there, and that will short, and that will be your electrical fire. That's your short in the system. That's your, you know, when the system fails. But that really gets into more of electronics, and anybody who can understand what I'm talking about, I'd be happy to discuss it with you. Anybody who's stuck in the tomb dogma, well, you just go ahead and worry about how that points to the North Star, and have a nice day.